Hello, today we'll be talking about a flow with which we can add users to a specific group based on their risk coming in from Okta. And the reason why we'll be talking about this today is because sometimes you may want to have different policies for people that are determined to be risky users, but also you want to be sharing those users that you consider to be risky into other services. So say for example, let me just scroll down for a second. And say for example, you've got your Okta tenant over here. I'm going to make a big fat diamond. And say that you have a connection to another service like Netscope, and then you have a connection to another service like CrowdStrike over here. And all of these services can see the users and groups within your Okta environment because you've given them permissions to do so. Now, what you would like to do is for these services to know, hey, which user within Okta do we consider to be risky? And then based on that, maybe Netscope can do things like block them from downloading stuff, and then CrowdStrike can potentially isolate that endpoint or make some other action, or whatever you choose. But we really want to communicate, hey, look, this user is risky from an Okta standpoint. And there's a few ways to do this. There's a way of sharing risk, which we will be covering off in another video. But in this video, what I would like to do is show you guys how we could do this from the perspective of adding users automatically to groups. So let me show you guys what I have. I've made this basic flow, and essentially the flow is that whenever there's an event where an admin reports a user to be risky, automatically that user gets added to a group called risky users group in their Okta environment, and that is triggered based off a workflow that I've got configured. Then I've also got an event where if an admin logs out a user and clears all their sessions, that user automatically gets removed from that risky users group and no longer has different policies applied to them. So say for example, a user in the risky users group might have an additional layer of MFA or may have to log in via a service, a specific network, or may have to be in the office, for example. But a user that's not part of that group wouldn't have any of those policies. So if I go into my dashboard, let me show you where you can do this. So if I go to security and I go to entity risk policy, what you can do is you can have certain rules where if a detection includes X, then do Y. So in my instance, what I've done is I've said if there is any admin reported user risk, then run a workflow. And the workflow that I have is called risky user auto rule. So I'll show you what this is. And by the way, the detection of risk could be something else. So it could be a suspected brute force attack. It could be a suspicious login. But just for the sake of this example, we're going to go with admin reported user risk. So let's take a person in my tenant and I'll show you how this works automatically, and then I'll show you the back end of what's happening. So I've got a user called Joe Fox. And if I go to Joe Fox, she has been assigned a bunch of apps and she's part of two groups, the sales group and the everyone group, which is everyone. Now, if I was to go to more actions and elevate entity risk level, so this would consider to be admin reported user risk, I can now change the risk of Joe Fox from low to high. And if I give this page a refresh, once again, let's see, this might take a second. So let's go back to Joe Fox. We'll see that she's been added to the risky users Okta group. And this happened as a result of a flow that I've got configured. So the flow that I showed you earlier, the risky user auto rule, it's a delegated flow. So that happens whenever I click this button over here and elevate user risk, which I've already clicked, so that's why it's grayed out. So whenever I click that, there's a flow that triggers, which is this flow. So you can see it ran 14 seconds ago. And essentially what it does is it takes that user and it adds them to that risky users group. And I've pasted the risky users group ID over here. Now what I would like to do is remove this person from that group, because now that Joe is part of this group, They would have different policies assigned to them, perhaps even different apps assigned to them. You might even want to have something like a training assigned to Joe because her risk has been elevated. But now things have changed. We found out that, maybe it was a false flag. Let's remove Joe's risk. So what we can do is clear her session. And before I do so, let me just show you the flow that I have for this. So I've called it remove users from risky group. And essentially what it is whenever I initiate a universal logout, I remove that user from that risky users group. And this is the same group ID that I used. So essentially, if I trigger something which logs out that individual universally across the board, we can also remove them from that risky users group. So let's show you guys how this works. So if I go to clear user sessions and I say this user will be logged out of all Okta sessions, as well as wherever they've clicked keep me signed in, they'll be logged out of that as well. If I clear and revoke that, you can see Joe's still in that risk users group, but when I give this a refresh, she will no longer be. So let me just go back to groups and to people, just so it refreshes, and I go to Joe again, Joe Fox, I go to groups, and I can see now she is no longer in the risky users group and her entity risk level is low. So now Joe would no longer have any of the risky users policies applied to her. So let's go back to the drawing board and see what happened. So Joe in the beginning was added to a risky users group, and because of this, there were certain policies that were applied to her. Let's make the policies red. Now, whenever I, as an admin, if I go and I clear her risk, then there's a flow that runs that removes her from that group. And let's make this green. And normal policies then apply to Joe. So that's a really easy way of doing these things. If you would like to, you can also have third-party risk making these decisions for you. So depending on risk from CrowdStrike, Netscope, or another service, a user gets added to a different group. But I just wanted to show you guys this quickly. I hope this has been helpful and looking forward to seeing you guys again soon.